Thanks, Edward, and thank you to Representative Haaland for being here today.
Thank you.
I want to start with climate. Earlier this month, you were appointed to Joe Biden's Climate Engagement Advisory Council, which is, to help mobilize voters on climate change in the fall ahead of the election. And, with so much going on in the news, with the pandemic, with protests, how do you keep attention on climate change?
That was my number one issue when I was running for this seat. In 2018, when I won my first election, climate change was my number one issue. There's no denying that if we don't have a planet, we don't have anything. And I think that with the pandemic and all of these things that have infiltrated our everyday lives, like we're worried about so much right now, climate change is still the number one issue. We are experiencing, warming in places where it should never be warm. And right now, when I think about the folks who are suffering from the pandemic in high rates, like in Indian country, those are the folks without running water, with clouds of methane hovering over their communities that exacerbate, a respiratory illness. So climate change is still the number one issue for me. I'm sure it always will be. And of course, very proud to be on the Climate Council with some amazing people. I had a meeting with Tom Steyer the other day to talk about how we were going to engage voters. And I think, this is an important issue. We'll keep talking about it, and we'll keep making sure that it's on the top of everyone's mind.
Well, you already alluded to environmental justice, which for any of our viewers who don't know is the focus on the disproportionate impact of environmental issues on people of color and indigenous communities, et cetera. And, Joe Biden came out with a big climate plan that has a lot of environmental justice provisions in it. And I'm curious, do you think that those provisions are enough? I mean, could you speak to that element of the plan?
So I think that, in and of itself, the Biden campaign appointing a climate council and coming out with a plan on climate change, it shows where his commitment is. Joe Biden realizes how important this issue is, and he's willing to work hard at it. I think there are a lot of climate leaders all over this country who are going to pitch in and make sure that we can keep moving our country forward. It makes me feel confident that we'll have leadership right now or in the future after the November election, because right now with this administration, gutting the EPA, taking climate scientists in the Department of the Interior, folks who were studying climate change in places like Alaska, and sticking them in the auditing department. This administration, cutting up big swaths of our public lands, wanting to drill and frack on our public lands everywhere. This administration has done nothing but make climate change so much worse than it needs to be, removing our country from the Paris Climate Agreement. President Biden, when he gets in office, will get us back on track and move us in a direction we absolutely need to move. And I completely trust that with all of us helping him, that we'll be able to make a real difference in this country.
Well, you represent a state that has a significant oil and gas industry. And I'm curious, how do you message to people in New Mexico who might be concerned about the, costs of a transition for their livelihood? What's your message to them?
Well, first of all, I don't want one single person to not be able to support their families, right? We want everyone to have a good job, a well-paying job with benefits so that they can support their families and contribute to our economy and all of those things. When I think about this issue, yes, we have a very robust gas and oil industry here. There's no reason that we can't work on moving our renewable energy forward at the same time. We're smart enough as a society to essentially walk and chew gum at the same time. One of the things that I really want to see happen, and as the vice chair on the House Natural Resources Committee and the chair of the subcommittee on national parks, forests, and public lands, our public lands emit 25% of carbon into the atmosphere here in this country. 25%. That's a huge number. Those are all of our public lands. There's no reason why we shouldn't get down to net zero on those lands. So a lot of the legislation that we're moving forward is to one of them, I'll just say, the 30 by 30 resolution to save nature sets a goal of preserving 30% of land and oceans by 2030. That in and of itself will protect habitat for species that are in danger of becoming extinct. It will get our emissions down, hopefully to net zero. There's a lot of things we can do. I want us to remember that our public lands are for all of us, not just for one sector or one industry.
Yeah, such an important point. I think oftentimes people think about net zero and they think about solar panels, and of course, protecting nature is crucial to that. I guess just one question, I'm curious, if you could share from your experience in the state, how are people in New Mexico feeling the effects of climate change right now? I mean, why is it so urgent there?
Well, I mean, there's no, it's no secret that places are getting warmer. We don't have as much snow as we used to have. People relied on snowpack. I talked to, some of my, I was talking to a man the other day who lives up in Las Vegas, New Mexico, and he was talking about on his graduation day in May, decades and decades ago, that it rained 4 feet in northern New Mexico. You don't see that anymore, and that's a shame. That we're barely having any snowfall here in New Mexico. We're at high desert, 5,000 feet. Water is always a scarce resource. Fires, wildfires are more intense when they catch fire, and we don't have the rain to dampen those fires out. So there's issue after issue that we're struggling with here in the high desert. And, as much as we are having to combat these wildfires that start, folks on the coastlines are losing their homes to the ocean. So it's absolutely everywhere. And we need to be diligent about doing something about this.
I want to switch gears a little bit. You've been very vocal about the Washington NFL team and the changing of the name. And of course, it's a significant victory that they've, said that they will do that, a victory for activists and critics. I'm curious, though, in this moment of reckoning, there's been a lot of changes like that are significant, but they're on the surface, changing a name and not necessarily dealing with the systemic issues in our society. And I'm just curious, is this a jumping off point to bigger systemic changes? And do obviously it's not enough, but is it a jumping off point?
Well, I think that it's progress, right? We have, for decades, it didn't just happen in the last few years, but for decades, Indian activists have been working to bring attention to this issue. And, you have really stubborn people like the owner of the Washington NFL team, who essentially was in denial about what the name of his football team was doing. I think that Native American activists have been present as long as, the Europeans have been working to colonize us. We're just sort of in a new phase, I guess. what I think it does is it brings attention to the need for all of us as Americans to think about this history. Native American history is American history. And since George Floyd died, God rest his soul, we've been dealing with the reckoning in our country about, what do we stand for? Are we really, do we really want liberty and justice for all? Do we really want these things? Do we really want America to be a place where everybody can be successful? And we're getting the answer back that no, only certain people deserve to be successful. And so it's caused more and more people to rise up and demand change. And I think that's incredibly good. And the naming of this football team, even though we had been fighting for it for a long, long time, it was timely to push it even more. And finally, it shouldn't take a huge social movement and corporate sponsors to threaten to threaten to threaten the team for them to change the name. But clearly that's what it took for this. And I think that it's a good time for all of us to reflect on the true history of our country.
Do you think, clearly this is a moment where there's been a reckoning over anti-Black racism, but do you think there's also been a reckoning with that history, with the treatment of and colonization of Native Americans? Has there been a reckoning there as well?
Well, I think with the Black Lives Matter movement that's been happening in our country for the last several months, it's a multicultural movement. There are many cultures, many, it's not just Black people marching, it's everybody marching. My daughter's been at all the protests here in Albuquerque, protesting with the Black Lives Matter groups here in my district. We're all together on this. All of us have joined hands to say communities of color want to banish institutional racism. They want racist stereotypes gone. We want to have an equal share of the success in this country. And how do we do that? And as a lawmaker, we responded thanks to the Congressional Black Caucus with the Justice in Policing Act. We've responded with the HEROES Act, to combat this pandemic and make sure that working families have an opportunity to get past this terrible crisis. I think that, it's our responsibility as lawmakers to move these issues forward and make sure that we have equality. I've been working on, for example, the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women since before I was even in Congress. That's an environmental justice issue. That's a justice issue because nobody was paying attention, and Native women deserve to be protected the same as any other women in this country. So I think we're all so connected in so many ways, and what the Black Lives Matter movement has done in recent months is sort of coalesce everybody around the same message.
Right. Well, I want to ask, inescapable, talking about the pandemic, and of course, New Mexico is surrounded by several states that are experiencing really the worst of it right now: Arizona, Texas, Oklahoma. And I'm just curious, what's the situation in your district? What are your constituents most concerned about when it comes to the COVID pandemic?
Well, I think besides everything, it's terrible that during a pandemic that this administration has worked to kick off millions of people from healthcare. Healthcare, insurance, getting the care that they need, people worried about having to pay for a COVID-19 test. So they don't go and get tested because they don't have the money to get tested. These are things that are just despicable. This is a public health crisis, and we need to make sure that everybody can get tested when they need to get tested and get the care they need. So I would have to say that just healthcare in and of itself It's a human right. And during a pandemic, we should not, this administration is despicable in the way that it's working to essentially kick people off of healthcare, because right now we need our country to step up for people who essentially can't afford to go to a doctor when they're sick.
What are your hopes for legislation, in the coming months in response to the pandemic? I mean, is there more that you hope to see out of Congress?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. We passed the HEROES Act 6 weeks ago, and it is sitting on the desk of Senator Mitch McConnell. It hasn't moved. And so I just, in that bill, in the HEROES Act, it's testing for everyone. It's healthcare for everyone. It's protecting our frontline workers and our other essential workers by making sure they have hazard pay. The HEROES Act is something that will help move our country past this pandemic in such a large way, and it's just disheartening that Senator Mitch McConnell hasn't touched it. For whatever reason, the Senate Republicans have no desire to move our country forward past this terrible pandemic. In the HEROES Act as well, we have over $800 billion for local governments. Right now, city governments and local governments are stepping up to do the part that the federal government should be doing. There has been no federal plan whatsoever. The Trump administration has not put forth a plan to tackle this pandemic. In the HEROES Act, we also have funding for tribes, for Indian tribes, to make sure that they have the funding they need to provide their communities with PPE and other things that they need. So I would say that we've done, if we could get that bill passed in and of itself, it would help a tremendous amount.
Well, I have one more question just to bring this conversation full circle, and it's a little bit of a follow-up. There's a lot of conversation about rebuilding better. I mean, this is the theme of Biden's climate plan. And I'm just curious whether you see any opportunity to do that in the fall, or is this something that needs to wait until a potential new president?
I'll tell you what, since I've been in Congress, and I think this goes for a large number of my colleagues, in fact, for likely every single one of my colleagues, we have all, we jumped in and we've all been working extremely hard. The House passed, well, by this time I think it was, it's well over 400 pieces of legislation in the House that have gone over to the Senate side. And Mitch McConnell, to a large degree, has not put a lot of those bills on the floor for a vote. And so I know that none of us are waiting. We're all working hard to pass legislation to protect our environment, to protect violence against women, to move our country forward. And it's unfortunate that the Senate majority is they are holding those bills up.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. It's much appreciated.
Thank you too.